You've been told Halloween comes from Celtic harvest festivals, that it's about honoring the dead, carved pumpkins, and kids in costumes. Cute story, incomplete story. The truth is more complex. Halloween isn't the legacy of one pagan tradition, it's the collision of two. The Druids brought one set of rituals, the Romans brought another. And when these two systems merged in the chaos of early medieval Europe, they created something the Church had to address. Tonight, we're examining the historical evidence, the Roman accounts of Druidic practices that shaped Celtic religious life, the archaeological discoveries found in bogs across Ireland, Britain, and Denmark, bodies that show evidence consistent with ritual execution. And we're revealing the specific Roman ritual, performed in darkness by terrified fathers, that shares remarkable structural similarities with children knocking on your door demanding candy under threat of mischief. We're going to walk through two distinct pagan systems, one Celtic, one Roman, that both centered on a single premise: the dead don't stay dead. They come back, and if you don't perform the correct rituals, there are consequences. The Celts believed you had to feed them. The Romans believed you had to expel them. The Church eventually absorbed both beliefs, merged them into observances around a single date, and overlaid them with Christian meaning. This is the dual origin that influenced Halloween's development. Let's begin. The Druids weren't priests in the way Christianity would later define priesthood. They were the political and religious infrastructure of Celtic society, lawmakers, judges, educators, astronomers, and mediators between the mortal world and the supernatural. In Gaul, Britain, and Ireland, no decision of consequence happened without Druidic approval. Julius Caesar documented this in his Commentari de Bello Gallico. He noted that the Druids formed a separate social class with immunity from military service and taxation. They held annual assemblies at sacred sites where they settled legal disputes from across tribal territories. Their rulings were absolute and unappealable. But here's the critical detail. Anyone who defied a Druidic ruling was banned from sacrifice, not jailed, not fined, banned from sacrifice. This meant complete exclusion from all religious ceremonies, which in Celtic society meant social death. You couldn't participate in communal rituals, you couldn't marry, you couldn't trade. You were effectively exiled within your own community. The Druids maintained this power through monopolized knowledge. They refused to write down their teachings. Everything was oral, memorized, passed from master to student over decades of training. Caesar noted some Druids spent 20 years in education before being fully initiated. This wasn't primitive ignorance. It was strategic information control. Written knowledge can be stolen, copied, distributed. Oral knowledge dies with its keeper, making the Druids indispensable. Their authority extended to the calendar itself. They determined when religious festivals began and ended. They interpreted astronomical events. They declared which days were auspicious and which were cursed. This gave them influence over agriculture, warfare, marriage, every aspect of life tied to seasonal timing. Their supreme authority manifested during Samhain, the Celtic festival marking the end of harvest and the beginning of winter, observed on what we now call October 31st. Samhain wasn't a harvest party, it was the night the cosmos fractured. The Celts believed reality was separated into two realms, the mortal world and the other world, home of the dead, the gods, and the side, spirits of ambiguous intent. These realms were separated by what's called the veil, an invisible boundary that kept the living and dead apart. Except on Samhain. On October 31st, the Celts believed the veil didn't just thin, it collapsed entirely. The dead could walk among the living. The side emerged from their mounds, the boundary between worlds dissolved. Only the Druids possessed the knowledge to manage this cosmic event. Only they knew the correct rituals, the proper offerings, the exact words and gestures required to ensure the veil would restore itself come dawn. The community depended on their expertise for this annual transition. Here's where the historical record becomes uncomfortable for those who prefer sanitized versions of paganism. Julius Caesar wrote explicitly about Druidic human sacrifice. In Book 6 of his Gallic Wars, he described enormous wicker structures, effigies shaped like humans or animals, which he claimed were filled with living people and set ablaze. He specified that the victims were typically criminals or prisoners of war, but when those sources ran short, others were substituted. Strabo, the Greek geographer writing around the same period, corroborated this and described multiple methods. Victims stabbed and their death convulsions read as prophecy, people drowned in sacred pools, and individuals burned in wooden enclosures. Now, we must acknowledge that Caesar and Strabo had political motives. Rome was justifying conquest. Depicting the Celts as barbaric made invasion easier to defend. This is legitimate historical criticism. Roman accounts should be viewed with appropriate skepticism. However, the archaeology provides compelling corroboration. The bog bodies are the key evidence. Bogs preserve organic material remarkably well. The anaerobic environment, combined with specific chemical conditions, essentially tans human skin. Bodies deposited in bogs can remain intact for millennia. In 1984, workers cutting peat in Lindo Moss, Cheshire, England, uncovered a human body. Radiocarbon dating placed it in the 1st century CE, during Roman-occupied Britain when Druidic practices were being suppressed but not yet extinct. Lindo Man's death showed deliberate overkill. Forensic analysis revealed he'd been struck twice on the head with a blunt instrument, hard enough to fracture his skull. Then he was garroted with a cord, breaking his neck. Then his throat was cut. Finally, he was deposited face down in the bog. Triple death. 3 methods employed in sequence. Analysis of his stomach contents revealed partially digested bread containing traces of mistletoe pollen. Mistletoe was sacred to the Druids. The elder described elaborate ceremonies where Druids cut mistletoe from oak trees with golden sickles. It was rarely consumed except in ritual contexts. His fingernails were manicured. His body showed no signs of heavy labor. This was someone of status, carefully prepared. He's not alone. Tolland Man, discovered in Denmark in 1950, was hanged with a plaited leather cord. Old Krogan Man, found in Ireland in 2003, had his arms bound and his nipples deliberately cut. A ritualized act specifically associated in Irish tradition with failed kings. Grobal Man, Clonikavan Man, Eyed Girl. The list continues. Each shows signs of violent, ritualized death. Each was deposited in liminal spaces, bogs that existed between land and water, between the solid and liquid. The pattern is consistent across Celtic territories and across centuries. While some modern scholars debate the extent and frequency of human sacrifice, the archaeological and textual evidence suggests these weren't isolated incidents, but part of systematic ritual practice. The theological reasoning becomes clear when we understand Celtic cosmology. The Celts operated on a principle of cosmic reciprocity. The universe was a balanced system of exchange. The gods provided fertility, protection, victory, good weather, successful harvests. In return, humans owed them offerings, and in critical moments, life itself. Samhain was the most dangerous transition point in the year. The old year died. The new year hadn't yet solidified. The veil was down. This was maximum vulnerability when ritual precision mattered most. The Druids were the only ones with the knowledge to perform these rituals correctly. They knew the words, the methods, the timing. The community accepted this authority because the alternative, failed rituals, unmanaged supernatural forces, seemed far worse. When Rome conquered Celtic territories, first Gaul under Caesar, then Britain under Claudius, they didn't just ban Druidism for religious reasons. They banned it because it represented a rival power structure that commanded absolute loyalty and operated outside Roman legal jurisdiction. Emperor Tiberius began moving against the Druids around 14 to 37 CE. Emperor Claudius formalized the ban around 54 CE. Suetonius recorded that Claudius abolished the Druids' religion entirely. But banning something doesn't erase cultural memory. It drives practices underground and makes them harder to document. When Christianity spread through former Celtic lands, slowly at first, accelerating after the 5th century, the Church faced the same challenge Rome had confronted. These weren't quaint folk traditions that could be redirected with sermons. These were deeply embedded practices tied to survival, to the agricultural calendar, to how reality worked. The Church couldn't simply preach Samhain out of existence. The date was too important. The fears were too real. The psychological need for ritual protection during seasonal transitions was too strong. So the Church did what Rome had attempted, but more comprehensively. It absorbed the practices, overlaid them with Christian interpretation, and gradually transformed cultural memory of their origins. Now we shift from Celtic practices to a superficially more refined Roman approach, but one ultimately rooted in similar fears. The Roman method of managing the dead. The Romans also feared the dead, deeply and systematically, but their approach differed fundamentally from the Celtic model in ways that matter for understanding modern Halloween. The Celts believed the dead needed to be honored and fed during Samhain, that the veil would thin naturally on October 31st, and the living needed to prepare appropriate offerings to ensure ancestral spirits and supernatural powers remained benevolent. The Romans believed something different. The dead needed to be expelled. They needed to be ritually pacified through precise performance, then forcibly driven out of the household. The dead weren't invited guests to be honored. They were dangerous intruders to be managed through exact procedural compliance. This distinction is critical. It's the foundation of the trick or treat mechanism. The Romans observed multiple festivals dedicated to managing relationships with the dead. Parentalia in mid-February, a week-long period of honoring ancestors. Feralia on February 21st, and Lemuria, observed on the nights of May 9th, 11th, and 13th. These weren't celebrations. They were acts of appeasement, pacification, and expulsion performed with the characteristic Roman belief that if you followed prescribed rituals exactly, down to the smallest detail, you could control supernatural forces through procedural compliance. The Romans believed the universe operated on contractual principles. Make the correct offering, speak the correct formula, perform the correct gestures at the correct time, and the gods were obligated to respond favorably. This was almost legalistic, a religious version of their famous contract law. But what happened if you failed to perform the rituals correctly? If you skipped a step, mispronounced a word, used the wrong offering, then you were on your own. The gods weren't obligated to protect you, and the malevolent dead were free to harm you without divine intervention. That fear powered the entire system. The Romans made a critical distinction that shaped their entire approach to death. They divided the dead into categories based on moral character and manner of death. The manes were the benevolent ancestral spirits, the collective mass of properly buried, properly honored dead who had lived decent lives and died natural deaths. If you maintained your family tomb, poured libations, left offerings, and performed correct prayers on appropriate days, the manes would protect your household. But then there were the Lemures. Ovid, in his Fasti, a poetic exploration of the Roman religious calendar, described the Lemures as spirits of the night who haunted houses, caused illness, drove people mad, and brought ruin to families. The poet Porphyrio, writing commentary on Horace in the 3rd century CE, provided more specificity. He explained that Lemures were the souls of the wicked, murderers, oath-breakers, those who'd betrayed family or community, but they were also the souls of those who died violently, prematurely, or without proper burial. This distinction matters. The Lemures weren't necessarily evil in life. A soldier killed in battle far from home, unable to receive proper burial rites, could become a Lemure, a woman who died in childbirth, a traveler murdered by bandits, a child who died suddenly. All risked becoming Lemures if proper funerary procedures weren't performed. Why? The Romans believed that proper burial and ritual observance allowed the soul to transition peacefully to the underworld. Without those rites, the soul remained trapped in the mortal world, unable to cross over, unable to find peace, and increasingly desperate and vengeful. The Lemures were defined by their inability to move on and their hostility toward the living. They weren't trying to reconnect with family. They were trying to hurt, harm, and destroy out of rage at their own condition. Apuleius, in The Golden Ass, described a man tormented by Lemures after failing to perform proper rituals. The spirits caused terrible dreams, inflicted illness, destroyed his property, and eventually drove him to madness. The fear was pervasive and genuine. Roman households went to extraordinary lengths to protect themselves. They buried protective amulets in walls. They hung iron above doorways, believing the metal repelled malevolent spirits. They planted specific herbs around foundations. But the primary defense was ritual, specifically the Lemuria ritual. Who had authority over the Lemures? Which deities controlled these malevolent spirits? The Roman pantheon included several chthonic deities associated with death and the underworld. Dis Pater, ruler of the underworld. Orcus, associated with punishment and oath enforcement. Pluto, keeper of underground wealth. But specifically relevant to the Lemures was the goddess Mania. Mania was the Roman goddess of madness, insanity, and the dead. Various sources described her as the mother or grandmother of the Lemures. She presided over these malevolent spirits, and they inherited her chaotic, vengeful nature. The connection between madness and malevolent ghosts made sense to Romans. If you were being tormented by Lemures, one primary symptom was psychological breakdown. You'd see things that weren't there, hear voices, become paranoid, violent, unable to function. The Lemures drove you mad as part of their torment. Mania was approached primarily through apotropaic rituals designed to keep her and her children away from your household. She wasn't a deity you sought favor from. She was a deity you desperately tried to avoid. The theological framework here is distinctly Roman. The gods didn't necessarily demand worship in the emotional, devotional sense that later Christianity would emphasize. They demanded procedure. They demanded that you perform correct rituals at correct times in correct manner. The gods didn't care whether you truly believed, whether you felt sincere devotion, whether you had a personal relationship with them. They cared whether you followed the rules. Do the ritual correctly, and you were protected by cosmic contract. Do it wrong, and face the consequences. This legalistic view of religion, where ritual precision mattered infinitely more than emotional sincerity, is characteristically Roman. It's the same mindset that produced Rome's famously detailed legal codes. And it produced one of the most specific, detailed supernatural rituals in the ancient world. A ritual that, when examined closely, shares remarkable structural similarities with modern trick-or-treating. Here's the specific Lemuria ritual as documented by Ovid in his Fasti. The details matter. At midnight on the nights of Lemuria, May 9th, 11th, and 13th, the paterfamilias, the male head of household, would wake while everyone else slept. He rose alone. He walked barefoot. Before beginning, he washed his hands 3 times in pure spring water from a living source. Then came the beans. He placed 9 black beans in his mouth without chewing them. Black specifically, the color associated with death and the underworld. 9 specifically, a sacred number associated with completion and chthonic powers. Beans specifically, because Roman popular belief held that beans contained souls of the dead. The paterfamilias then walked through every room of the house, moving backward. Not forward like a living person, backward like a ghost. As he moved through each room, he spit out the beans one at a time, chanting as each bean left his mouth, Haec ego mito, his redemo mec meosque fabis. Translation: These I send, with these beans I redeem me and mine. The beans were substitutes, offerings, payments. The paterfamilias was purchasing his family's safety by providing the Lemures with acceptable tribute. Take the beans, take what they represent, and leave us alone. But he couldn't look back. He couldn't see where the beans fell. He couldn't acknowledge whether any spirit had accepted the offering. Looking back would break the spell entirely. After spitting out all 9 beans, he returned to the starting point and washed his hands again. 3 times. The same purification. Then came the expulsion phase. He took a bronze vessel. Bronze specifically because iron repelled spirits entirely, while bronze allowed them to hear but still repelled malevolent intent. He struck the bronze vessel repeatedly, creating loud, clanging, metallic noise that echoed through the house. As he created this noise, he walked through the house again, still barefoot, still moving backward, chanting, "Mains exit paterni! Ghosts of my fathers, depart!" Not "please leave," not "if it pleases you, consider departing." Depart. A command, an order. The paterfamilias was using ritual authority to expel the dead from his household. He repeated this 9 times, 9 circuits, 9 repetitions, 9, that number again, the number of completion and binding. Only after completing all 9 circuits could he turn around and look behind him. Only then could he consider the house purified, the Lemures expelled, and his family safe. The psychological impact of this ritual is striking. Imagine performing this in complete darkness, no electric lights, maybe not even an oil lamp. Walking backward through your own home, spitting beans you can't see where they land, clanging bronze in the silence of midnight, shouting commands at invisible spirits you desperately hope are listening, and knowing that if you got it wrong, if you looked back too soon, if you stumbled on the words, if you used wrong materials, your family could face supernatural torment. Now connect the mechanism to modern Halloween. The structural parallels are significant. The beans were offerings, proto-treats. The noise was both threat and protective measure, proto-tricks. The entire ritual was based on transaction. Take this offering and leave, or face the consequences of our ritual authority. The paterfamilias wasn't passively hoping the Lemures would choose to leave. He was commanding them to depart using ritual noise, backward movement, and offerings that the spirits were obligated to accept under Roman religious logic. This provides a template remarkably similar to trick or treat. Not the Celtic element of honoring ancestors with food that provided the timing and one aspect of the treat, but the Roman Lemuria provided the mechanism, the active demand, the implicit threat, the requirement that the household provide tribute or face consequences. In medieval practice, which evolved over centuries, this became souling and guising. Children, the poor or costumed performers, would go door to door representing the dead. They would make noise, singing, chanting, rattling chains. They would demand food, drink, or money. And they would explicitly threaten mischief or bad luck if the householder refused. The householder, like the Roman paterfamilias, provided the offering not purely out of generosity, but out of a complex mix of charity, tradition, and lingering belief that refusal carried risk. Pay the tribute, and the dead, or their representatives, would move on to the next house. Refuse and risk consequences. The masks came later, borrowed from multiple traditions, but the transactional logic bears Roman influence. Dress as the spirits, make noise like the spirits, demand tribute like the spirits, use ritual performance to establish authority over the supernatural or those representing it. That's the structural foundation of trick or treat, and it shares remarkable similarities with Roman expulsion rituals. But here's the critical question. How did a Roman ritual performed in May merge with a Celtic festival observed in October? The Romans expelled the dead during Lemuria in May. The Celts honored the dead during Samhain in October. 2 completely different calendars, 2 completely different cosmological frameworks, 2 cultures that had been enemies for centuries. So how did they combine? The answer lies in conquest. cultural collision, and religious adaptation over centuries. When Rome absorbed Celtic territories, you didn't get instant cultural replacement. You got generations of messy coexistence where both traditions continued, sometimes practiced by the same people in different contexts. And when Christianity arrived, it faced both traditions simultaneously. It couldn't eliminate either through preaching alone. So it did something more pragmatic. It synthesized them. Before we put the pieces together, leave a like so we know you're following along. This is where the fusion occurs. When Rome conquered Celtic territories, first Gaul under Julius Caesar from 58 to 50 BCE, then Britain starting under Claudius in 43 CE, it didn't produce instant cultural replacement. Roman conquest brought Roman administration, Roman law, Roman military, and Roman state religion, but it didn't immediately erase Celtic identity or practices. What emerged was hybrid culture, especially in countryside regions away from Roman urban centers. Celtic tribes continued observing their traditional calendar, while also participating in Roman civic religion where necessary. They honored their ancestors during Samhain while also, if they had Roman contacts, acknowledging Roman festivals like Lemuria. For generations, centuries in some regions, these two systems ran parallel. The Roman calendar dominated official civic life in cities. The Celtic calendar dominated agricultural and tribal life in rural areas. Many people simply observed both, seeing no particular contradiction. Then Christianity arrived, and the situation became more complex. Christianity didn't conquer pagan Europe through superior theology alone. It expanded through syncretism, the strategic blending of existing practices with Christian meanings. Church leadership understood something crucial. You couldn't erase deeply embedded cultural practices by simply condemning them. People would resist conversion or practice in secret. Instead, you absorbed the practices. You gave them Christian explanations. You overlaid Christian holy days on pagan festivals. You transformed pagan deities into Christian saints or demons. You kept the structure but changed the interpretation. This wasn't entirely cynical accommodation. This was practical missionary strategy. Pope Gregory I made it explicit in a letter to Bishop Mellitus in 601 CE, instructing missionaries in Britain, "Do not destroy the temples of the gods, but convert them to Christian use. Do not abolish the festivals, but dedicate them to Christian martyrs, so that the people may continue their celebrations but redirect their devotion." That's the documented strategy. That's how the synthesis happened. Here's how the specific elements combined. The Celts contributed the timing. Samhain, October 31st, was deeply embedded in agricultural cycles: the end of harvest, the beginning of winter, the death of the growing season. It marked a genuine transition in the natural world that everyone could observe. You couldn't just move it to another date without breaking its connection to observable seasonal reality. The Celts also contributed the offering to the dead, the belief that spirits required feeding, that providing for the dead would ensure their benevolence or at least their neutrality. This became part of the treat concept, the obligation of the living to provide for the dead or their representatives. The Romans contributed the expulsion mechanism, the idea that the dead didn't just need honoring, they needed to be controlled and forcibly removed if necessary. The noise, the backward walking, the bronze clanging, the performative command. This became the trick element, the implicit or explicit threat of mischief if tribute wasn't provided. The combination, a ritual on the Celtic calendar, October 31st, incorporating Celtic logic of feeding and honoring the dead, treats, merged with the Roman mechanism of ritual expulsion and commanded departure, tricks threats. That synthesis produced the foundation for medieval practices that would eventually evolve into modern Halloween. And it worked because both traditions shared a fundamental premise. The dead return, and specific rituals are necessary to manage their return safely. The Church could work with that premise. After all, Christianity also taught that the dead would return. at the Last Judgment. Christianity also taught that proper ritual observance mattered for salvation. The theological framework wasn't entirely incompatible. It just needed reframing. The Church's response was calendar appropriation combined with theological reinterpretation. All Saints' Day was officially established as a universal feast by Pope Gregory III in the 8th century, specifically placed on November 1st. All Souls' Day was added on November 2nd by Odilo of Cluny in 998 CE. The timing wasn't coincidental. These dates were chosen specifically to absorb and redirect the energy of Samhain and its associated practices. The Church created Christian festivals that occupied the same psychological and cultural space as the pagan ones, giving people Christian alternatives to pagan observances. The Church transformed the Celtic honoring of the dead into prayers for Christian souls in purgatory. It transformed offerings to pagan spirits into alms for the Christian poor. It transformed the Samhain fires into Christian bonfires celebrating saints and martyrs. It transformed costumes and masks from protection against malevolent spirits into representations of angels and saints. But calendar overlay alone wasn't sufficient. The Church also needed to manage the cultural memory of these practices' origins. This happened gradually over centuries through control of literacy and historical narrative. Monks copied manuscripts, wrote histories, and preserved knowledge, but they did it selectively. They copied what supported Christian narratives. They reinterpreted pagan sources through Christian frameworks in their commentaries. They gradually transformed pre-Christian practices from religious necessities into folklore and superstition. When Irish monks copied down old Celtic tales, they preserved them but added Christian framings. They turned pagan deities into ancient kings. They transformed cosmic battles into historical wars. They made sacrifice into metaphor. The Roman sources on Druidic practices, often dismissed as conquest propaganda despite archaeological corroboration. The bog bodies, explained as criminals or rare exceptions. The medieval practices of souling and guising, treated as spontaneous customs that emerged organically with diminishing awareness of their ancient pagan roots. This transformation happened slowly, across generations. Each copying of a manuscript was an opportunity for interpretation. Each chronicle was written from a Christian perspective. Each theological commentary reframed pagan practices through Christian cosmology. The result? By the high medieval period, most Christians in Europe had limited awareness that All Saints' Day and All Souls' Day were overlaid on Samhain. They didn't know that trick-or-treating descended from Roman expulsion rituals and Celtic offerings. They thought these were purely Christian observances or harmless folk customs. The practices survived because they addressed psychological needs the Church couldn't fully eliminate: the desire to honor the dead, the need for ritual during seasonal transitions, the deep human concern about death and the afterlife. So the practices continued, dressed in Christian language, overlaid with Christian meaning, but structurally similar to their pagan origins. Let's be clear about what happened. This wasn't a gentle cultural evolution where Christian and pagan ideas naturally blended over time through mutual influence. This was strategic appropriation. The Church absorbed existing practices, existing dates, and existing cosmological frameworks, then overlaid them with Christian interpretation while gradually transforming cultural memory of the pagan foundations. The Church didn't invent Halloween. It didn't create the customs or design the rituals. It absorbed them. It took the calendar date from the Celts, October 31st, Samhain, the night when the veil between worlds collapsed. It incorporated the expulsion mechanism that shared similarities with Roman Lemuria rituals. It took the entire cosmological framework that both cultures shared: the dead return, and specific rituals help manage their return. Then it overlaid Christian meaning: All Saints' Day, All Souls' Day, prayers for the faithful departed, and gradually transformed the narrative about these practices' origins. This was effective missionary strategy. The church needed to control understandings of death and the afterlife because controlling those meant controlling spiritual authority. If people believed old pagan rituals actually worked, that traditional practices genuinely protected communities, then Christian salvation couldn't claim exclusive validity. So the church absorbed the practices, reframed them through Christian theology, and over centuries transformed cultural memory of their origins. Halloween is not a Christian holiday that borrowed a few pagan decorations for aesthetic purposes. Halloween emerged from the collision and gradual synthesis of multiple pagan traditions, Celtic and Roman among others, that existed centuries before Christianity reached Northern Europe. The Druids brought the understanding that October 31st was when the veil collapsed and the dead walked freely, requiring specific ritual responses. The Romans brought legalistic, procedural rituals for expelling the dead from households through precise performance. When Christianity encountered both traditions in formerly Roman Celtic territories, it absorbed rather than eliminated them. That's trick or treat. That's the costume tradition. That's the jack-o'-lantern on your porch. That's the party this weekend. It's not modern invention. It's not purely Christian. It's the evolved descendant of practices that once addressed genuine fears about death, seasonal transition, and supernatural forces beyond human control. The church overlaid these practices with Christian meaning and gradually obscured their pagan origins. But underneath the commercialization, underneath the Christian reinterpretation, the basic structure remains: give offerings to the dead or their representatives, or face the implicit threat of mischief. The practices have been transformed almost beyond recognition, but the foundation is still there, preserved in forms we perform without fully understanding their origins. The full story of Halloween has one more dark chapter. Next, we uncover the true history behind the single darkest icon of the night, the jack-o'-lantern. Until next time, keep questioning.